So the reason there was a civil war was that the South wanted slavery and the North didn't want it, right?
Yes, Jeffrey. To a large degree, that's true. But there's more to it than that. As we saw, the North was very different from the South. It had large cities with factories, while the South was, for the most part, an agricultural region. And to many in the South, the differences in the way they lived could not be bridged. Moreover, Southerners, as voiced by their representatives in Congress, were fearful of a slave revolt, perhaps led by Northern abolitionists, such as John Brown. Most Southerners also disliked the federal government in Washington, which they believed made too many laws on matters better left to the states. Finally, most Southerners felt that they would lose their sense of honor if they didn't stand up to the North.
So was there anything that actually started the war?
Well, Lily, let's go back to the fall of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln ran for president and won. With his election, the Republican Party controlled all three branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And many Republicans wanted to abolish slavery, thinking that it was only a matter of time until slavery would be outlawed by the federal government. A South Carolina Secession Convention was held on December 20th, 1860. It voted to secede, or break away from the United States. Within 3 months, 6 other southern states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, also seceded. Immediately, those 7 states started taking over federal court buildings, post offices, and federal arsenals where weapons were stored. They also seized U.S. military forts located in their newly formed country, the Confederate States of America. Abraham Lincoln, when he became president, pledged to stop those takeovers.
The power given to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government.
One fort that hadn't been seized yet was Fort Sumter, about a mile off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. President Lincoln wrote a letter to officials in that state. The letter said that he was sending some ships with food and other provisions for the soldiers at the fort. But a group of South Carolina officials thought there would be weapons on the ships, so they asked Confederate General Pierre Beauregard to order the Union soldiers to vacate, that is, to leave the fort. When Fort Sumter's commander, Major Robert Anderson, refused, Southern forces opened fire. And with that, the American Civil War began. The date was April 12, 1861. Almost immediately, 4 more states, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, joined the Confederacy. President Lincoln then promptly called for 75,000 volunteers to put down what he called a domestic insurrection.
So he didn't go to war to free the slaves?
Oh no, Lily. That would come later. At first, he just wanted to save the Union.
So did President Lincoln get those 75,000 volunteers?
Oh yes, and then some. Nobody expected the fighting to last as long as it did. And there was a lot of excitement about the upcoming conflict. The new soldiers, as well as most other people, thought the dispute would be a wonderful adventure that would last perhaps only 6 months, if that. And there was good reason for that optimism, for the North had a huge advantage in manpower. Its population was 22.5 million, while the South had only 9 million people, of which 4.2 million were slaves. The North had 110,000 manufacturing companies and more than 1 million industrial workers, many of whom could make guns, ammunition, cannons, and so forth. Compared to the North, the South had about 85,000 fewer manufacturing establishments and some 900,000 fewer industrial workers. Trains that could carry war material to the troops was another big Northern advantage. The North had 80% of all railroad miles in the U.S. Not only that, railroad tracks in the South had different sizes, so some shipments had to be transferred from one train to another, creating long delays when military equipment had to be shipped to a battle scene. Finally, the North had a government to run the war, while the South had to create a brand new government, and it had to be created from states that did not like big, powerful governments, the kind needed to create and manage a large army in the 1860s.
But the war lasted for 4 whole years, so the South must have had some advantages.
Yes, Jeffrey, they did. For one thing, they had a 2,000-mile coastline where war supplies from Europe could be shipped. Those supplies came mostly from Great Britain and France, at least until 1864, when the Union Navy blocked European ships from reaching southern ports. The South also had many rivers on which supplies could be carried, helping it to overcome its railroad problem. Furthermore, most battles were fought in the South, so supplies didn't have to be shipped long distances. But perhaps the greatest advantage was the South's military leadership. During the war, President Lincoln had to replace his top generals 15 times, mostly due to their poor leadership. The South simply had much better generals. Robert E. Lee is a prime example, and in many instances, better soldiers who had a clear purpose: independence for the southern states.
So that brings us to the battles, right?
Indeed it does, Lily. For more than 3 months, many Northern soldiers, that is, Union soldiers, did little more than practice marching. It was said that one Union general, George B. McClellan, was much more fond of parades than leading his men into battle. The commander of the Union Army in the East, General Irvin McDowell, wasn't eager to fight either. When President Lincoln urged him to move his troops south to engage Confederate forces, the general said they weren't ready for combat. In fact, he said, they were so poorly trained they didn't even know how to retreat properly. But Lincoln, pressured by public opinion, insisted that they fight. And on July 21st, 1861, several hundred civilians, many congressmen with their wives and children, rode about 20 miles with picnic lunches for a summer outing and to watch the first major battle of the war, the first battle of Bull Run. Much to their surprise and to the shock of many others, the Union forces were routed. Because they didn't know how to retreat orderly, the Northern soldiers broke rank and fled back to Washington. It immediately became clear that the war would not end within 6 months. General McClellan took over the defeated force called the Army of the Potomac and began to drill his men day after day and month after month. Finally, after more than 6 months, President Lincoln lost patience and wrote McClellan saying,
General, if you're not going to use your army, might I borrow it?
If General McClellan was head of the Army of the Potomac, were there other Northern armies?
Oh, yes, indeed. For instance, in early 1862, there were both naval and army forces in the West in Tennessee, on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. They successfully attacked Fort Henry near the Tennessee River on February 6, 1862, and 9 days later, they attacked Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. The commander of the Union Army, Colonel Ulysses S. Grant, wrote a message to the commander of Fort Donelson, General Simon Buckner, who was his roommate when they were students at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. The message said,
Hello, friend. You will surrender all your forces and all your guns, or I will move on you immediately.
Well now, Ulysses, can we talk?
No.
And with that, Fort Donelson fell to the Union forces. The Northern victories over the 2 forts opened a route that the Union military could take into the Confederate heartland. Another important battle in the West took place at Shiloh, Tennessee, 6 weeks later. On the night of April 5th and early morning of April 6th, Confederate soldiers, their boots and wagon wheels wrapped in cloth to muffle any sounds of movement, quietly sneaked out of Corinth, Mississippi, and headed 2 miles north to Shiloh, where thousands of Union soldiers were encamped. Only a few Northern soldiers were up at dawn when the surprise attack began. The first day, the Confederate forces completely overwhelmed the Northern Army. But Union reinforcements arrived at night, and recently promoted General Ulysses Grant and other officers reorganized the defeated soldiers and counterattacked the next day at dawn. It was a horrible battle with hand-to-hand combat. In the end, the Union forces were victorious, but both sides paid a terrible price. There were more than 23,000 casualties, the highest number of any American battle up to that date.
Gosh, and there were 2 more years of war to go.
Yes, and many, many more clashes. After Shiloh, there were huge battles at Antietam in Maryland, at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, at Vicksburg, Mississippi, at Atlanta, Georgia, and other places. When President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the document that freed the slaves, on January 1st, 1863, the reason for the war changed. At first, as I mentioned, it was a war to save the Union, but now it was a war to free the slaves, and by ending slavery would change the way people lived in the South. To many, such as the North's General William Tecumseh Sherman, the war would not be won until the South's economy was ruined, its businesses, its agriculture, and its bridges, roads, and railroads. Sherman's March to the Sea, as it's called, destroyed a large swath of Georgia, leaving desolation in its path. That signaled the war would soon end.
Oh, wait! Don't we know those people?
Those are the people at the plantation. The ones who said having slaves was the right thing to do. We saw them before lunch.
That's right, Jeffrey. Their world was destroyed, as it was for many other white people in the South, when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant on April 9, 1865, at a courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia. The terrible conflict was over. 620,000 people were killed, more than in any other American war. Now, let's go back inside, where I'll show you that when the war ended, life was very different for both black people and white people in the South during a period called Reconstruction.
Before the Civil War, many Southerners, A, were fearful of a slave revolt, B, believed the government in Washington made too many laws on matters better left to the states, C, both A and B. True or false? When Abraham Lincoln became president, the 3 branches of government were controlled by the Democratic Party. The first Southern state to secede from the Union was The Civil War began when A, Fort Henry was attacked, B, Fort Donelson was attacked, C, Fort Sumter was attacked. True or false? When the Civil War broke out, everyone knew it would last a long time. The South's biggest advantage in the war was its The first major battle of the war was at A, Shiloh, B, Bull Run, C, Gettysburg. True or false? The Union victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson opened a route into the Confederate heartland. The purpose of the war changed on January 1, 1863, when President Lincoln signed the